A few years ago, I worked as a waitress in a small restaurant along an isolated highway. The nights were usually quiet. Sometimes hours would go by without a single customer coming in. The restaurant was on the outskirts of town, surrounded by fields and very few nearby businesses. It was a monotonous job, but it gave me time to think, sometimes too much time. I remember there was always something in the air during the nights at that place, a sense of emptiness and silence that grew heavier as the hours passed. My shift started at 8 in the evening and ended at dawn, and while I enjoyed the solitude, some nights made me wish for company. That particular night, it was raining. The storm was the only thing breaking the silence as I sat behind the counter, watching the rain hit the windows. Only one customer had come since my shift began, but they had already paid and left. It seemed the storm was keeping any potential customers away, leaving the place completely empty. It was almost 10 o'clock when the restaurant phone rang, something that rarely happened at that hour. I answered with a bit of curiosity, but on the other end I heard a deep, slow voice. The man didn't say his name, he just ordered a delivery. His tone was cold, distant, and he explained that I had to deliver the food to a place I didn't recognize, a location much farther than usual. What surprised me most was his offer. He offered double the normal fee if I agreed to personally deliver the order. It was raining hard, and while I didn't like the idea of driving through the storm, the money made me reconsider. I finally agreed. I told him I would be there in about 40 minutes. I prepared the order, though the sense of unease inside me grew stronger. Even so, I convinced myself that there was nothing to worry about. It was just another delivery. But something about that man's voice had left me unsettled, as if it wasn't just a regular customer call. I left the restaurant with the order in hand, making sure to lock up before leaving. The rain hadn't let up, and the sound of water against the windshield was almost deafening. As I drove down the deserted highway, I couldn't shake the thought of that man's call. Why would someone order food to such a remote location in the middle of a storm? The road was dark. I could barely see a few meters ahead of me. The headlights barely illuminated the road, and the sound of the rain only amplified my nervousness. As I drove, a strange feeling came over me. It was as if something was watching me from the darkness. Suddenly, I noticed a shadow at the edge of the road. I instinctively slowed down, but when I looked closer, I didn't see anything. Fear began to creep in, and though I tried to focus on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After a few more minutes of driving, I finally arrived at the address. It was an old house on the edge of a field. I could barely make it out through the fog and rain. The place looked abandoned, with broken windows and overgrown weeds covering the facade. Even though the sense of danger had intensified, I stepped out of the car with the order in hand. I walked slowly towards the door, hoping someone would appear. Just as I was about to knock on the door, I felt something move behind me. I spun around and there it was, a dark figure standing just a few meters away, completely still. I couldn't make out its face, but its eyes. They were fixed on me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. Panic paralyzed me. I couldn't move. I just watched as the figure began to slowly walk toward me. Without thinking, I dropped the food and ran back to the car. My heart was pounding. Rain was hitting my face as I struggled to open the door. I threw myself into the car, started the engine, and sped away without looking back. The fear of knowing that thing was so close made me tremble. As I sped down the highway, I couldn't stop looking in the rearview mirror. I expected to see that dark figure behind me, but the storm and the darkness made it impossible to make anything out. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The road seemed endless, and the feeling of being chased wouldn't leave me. Every sound in the car, from the tires on the pavement to the rain pounding on the roof, made me jump. I was convinced that figure was still after me, hidden in the storm, waiting for the moment to reappear. I pressed harder on the gas, barely aware of how fast I was going. All I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between me and that cursed house. Suddenly, something crossed in front of the car. I couldn't make out what it was, but I swerved sharply to avoid it. The car skidded on the wet asphalt, and though I managed to regain control, panic overwhelmed me. I convinced myself I couldn't stop, not even to find out what had just happened. I just needed to get to safety. After what felt like hours of driving in terror, I finally saw the lights of the town in the distance. The sense of relief was overwhelming, and my hands were still shaking as I maneuvered to park in front of the restaurant where I worked. I had barely turned off the engine when something tapped on the window. I screamed in fear, but when I turned, I saw the worried face of Javier, one of the restaurant's cooks. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a nervous smile. I told him what had happened, trying to calm down, but the more I talked, the more surreal everything sounded. Javier listened in silence until I mentioned the old house and the dark figure. "Wait," he said, "that house has been abandoned for years. No one has lived there since the owner disappeared a decade ago. The police never found him." My blood ran cold. Had I delivered food to an empty house? And that figure? What or who had followed me that night? A chill ran down my spine. Though Javier tried to reassure me, the questions kept haunting my mind. I went home that night, but the memory of that figure and that abandoned house still haunts me. I haven't worked a night shift since, and every time I pass by that area, I speed up without looking back. I don't want to know what was really in that house, nor who or what was following me. A few years ago, I worked at a small family restaurant. It wasn't anything grand, but it paid the bills, and the best part was that my shifts were at night, just the way I liked it. I got used to the solitude of those late shifts, with only the occasional customer passing through on their way home. There was something comforting about the routine of cleaning empty tables and listening to the soft music I always played in the background. I never felt in danger until he showed up. The first time I saw him, he didn't seem out of the ordinary. He was a tall, middle-aged man, always wearing a gray coat, even when it wasn't cold. He came in just as we were about to close and ordered a coffee. Nothing special at the time, though I clearly remember the discomfort that washed over me when I noticed how he looked at me. He wasn't rude, and he didn't say anything strange, but there was something in his gaze that gave me chills. That day, I let it go. I thought it was just the exhaustion from a long shift, or maybe I was overreacting. But then he came back, and he came back again. Every night, around the same time, just as we were about to close, the man in the grey coat appeared, always ordering the same thing, always insisting that I be the one to serve him. At first, I tried not to think much of it, assuming he was just a regular customer. But there was something about his presence, about the way he watched me, that deeply unsettled me. As the days went by, his behavior became more peculiar. He started asking me personal questions. "Do you live nearby? Do you always get off work at this time? Do you live alone?" Questions that made me uncomfortable, but I tried to answer vaguely so it wouldn't seem like I was avoiding him. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, that he was probably just a curious person. But there was something in the way he kept pressing for more information about me, as if he was going to use it for something else. One night, after his usual coffee and awkward questions, the man got up to leave. But instead of walking straight out, he paused near the door, staring at me for a long moment before finally leaving. That was the first time I felt real fear. There was something in his gaze, in his stance, that told me he wasn't just any customer. There was something darker, something I couldn't quite understand. I spoke to my boss about what was happening, but he reassured me, saying the man was probably just a lonely customer looking for some company. Even so, with each passing night, that feeling of unease grew stronger. I found myself glancing out the window more often, checking to see if he was there before leaving the restaurant. And every time I saw him, I knew something was very wrong. One night, everything felt different. Closing time came, but this time the man in the grey coat didn't show up. At first, I felt relieved, thinking that maybe he had finally ended his strange routine. I turned off the lights, gathered my things, and headed for the door, ready to go home. But then I saw him. He was standing across the street, in the darkness, right under a dim streetlight. He wasn't moving, just watching me, completely still. My heart started racing, and a wave of panic washed over me. What did he want from me? Why hadn't he come inside like before? I tried to calm myself, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that maybe he had simply taken a different path. I decided to walk faster than usual, but as I turned the corner and glanced back, I saw him. He was following me. He wasn't running, but his slow, steady pace kept me on edge. There was no escape, and the more I tried to ignore him, the more present the fear became inside me. The fear began to overwhelm my senses. With every step, I could feel his eyes on me. My mind raced, thinking of all the possible ways out. The streets were empty, and the nearby shops had already closed. My only thought was to run, but at the same time, I didn't want to appear desperate or let him see that I was scared. In a moment of pure terror, I decided to run. I crossed the street and ran down the empty streets, not daring to look back. I could hear my footsteps echoing on the pavement, and for a second, I thought I had lost him. But then, I heard something. I wasn't sure if it was the echo of my own steps, or if he had started running too, but the panic pushed me to run even faster. Finally, as I turned a corner, I saw a group of people at a 24-hour store. My heart leaped with relief. Without thinking twice, I ran toward them and joined the group, trying to act as normal as possible. I could feel his gaze. I could feel his presence in the distance, but he didn't come any closer. I stayed in the store for a while, and when I finally dared to look outside, he was gone. After that encounter, I stayed in the store for a long time, pretending to shop just so I wouldn't have to leave right away. My heart was still pounding, and even though I didn't see him anymore, I felt like the danger wasn't completely gone. I knew I couldn't stay in the store forever, so I gathered the courage to leave and head home, hoping that it would be the last time I ever saw him. I walked quickly to my apartment, constantly checking my surroundings, making sure he wasn't following me. When I finally reached home, I slammed the door shut and collapsed on the couch. I felt exhausted, both physically and mentally. Who was that man, and what did he want from me? Although I was safe for now, the fear of encountering him again consumed me. The days that followed were strange. I didn't see him anymore, not at the restaurant or anywhere nearby. But the paranoia had taken root in me. Every time I left work, I made sure the doors were locked tightly, and I always checked twice to see if anyone was following me. Even though it seemed like it was over, the experience had left a deep mark. Eventually, I decided I couldn't live like that anymore. The thought of seeing that man again terrified me, and I couldn't live with that constant fear. So I made a decision. I quit my job at the restaurant and moved to another city, far away from that place I now associated with terror and anxiety. Although I never saw the man in the grey coat again, his memory still lingers in my mind like a persistent shadow. I don't know who he was or why he followed me, but I'm grateful to have escaped his presence, to have left behind a story that haunts my dreams, but is no longer part of my daily life. Several years have passed since I worked at that small restaurant, especially during the night shift. It wasn't a job I was passionate about, but it had the advantage of being quiet, with few customers at that hour. The restaurant was located in a small town where rarely anything out of the ordinary happened. Every night followed the same routine, serving a few customers, cleaning up a bit, and waiting for the shift to end. I always thought the night shift offered me a sense of peace, a kind of cozy solitude. However, that changed when a very peculiar customer began showing up. He started coming right before closing time, as if he calculated the perfect moment to arrive when there was hardly anyone left. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just someone who preferred the quiet, like me. But as the days went by, his presence became more constant and more unsettling. At first, he served himself with a polite smile and a quick order, but little by little, he began asking me personal questions. Do you live nearby? How long does it take you to get home? Do you always work alone? Questions that made me increasingly uncomfortable. I tried to be polite, giving minimal answers without revealing too much. But with each passing night, I felt his presence becoming more insistent. As if he was trying to cross an invisible boundary, I had attempted to build between us. The atmosphere of the restaurant, which once felt so peaceful, began to change. The silence at the end of the shift no longer relaxed me. It put me on edge, as if something invisible and dangerous was lurking around. That strange feeling intensified every time he was there, sitting at his usual table, watching me in a way that made me feel exposed. The worst part was that I didn't know anymore if it was just my imagination, or if I was truly in danger. One night, after several weeks of his constant presence, something different happened. The man didn't show up. I remember feeling momentary relief, as if an invisible weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I finished the shift feeling a little more relaxed, thinking that maybe it had all just been paranoia. I turned off the restaurant's lights, grabbed my things, and left. However, as I crossed the door and headed toward my car, I saw him. He was on the other side of the street, standing on a corner, half hidden under the shadow of a tree. He didn't move, he was just there, silently watching. A chill ran through my body. I didn't understand why he hadn't come into the restaurant that night. But what terrified me the most was realizing that it wasn't a coincidence. He wasn't there by chance. He was waiting for me. I tried to stay calm and walked quickly to my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys in my bag. All I wanted was to get home, lock myself in, and forget about that figure in the darkness. But something inside me knew he wouldn't stop there. I started the car quickly, constantly checking the rearview mirror. At first, I thought he would stay on the corner, that maybe he was just trying to scare me. But when I saw a car behind me, a knot formed in my stomach. Its headlights followed me from a distance, staying just close enough for me to notice its presence. I sped up, trying not to panic, but the car sped up too. My heart was pounding as I drove down the empty streets. I knew I couldn't go home. What if he knew where I lived? What if he had already found out more about me than I imagined? Thoughts swirled in my mind as the tension grew with every mile I drove. I decided to make a sharp turn onto a side street, hoping to throw him off. For a few seconds, I didn't see the car's headlights. But just when I thought I had lost him, there they were again, following me closely. I couldn't believe what was happening. The chase became more real and terrifying, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. With the car still following me, desperation began to take over. My mind raced, searching for an escape. The streets I was driving through were completely deserted, and the darkness only made the fear grow inside me. I turned onto another street, this time a brighter avenue, hoping to see someone who could help. That's when I saw a group of people at the end of the street, near a cafe that was closing. I didn't think twice. I sped up and quickly parked next to them. I jumped out of the car in total panic and ran toward them, almost stumbling over my own feet. "Please, help me," I shouted with a trembling voice. I quickly explained that someone was following me. The group's faces shifted from confusion to concern in a matter of seconds. One of the men in the group stepped toward the curb to look down the street, where the car that had been following me stopped for a moment. I could feel the terror in my throat, waiting for the worst. However, instead of continuing to follow me or confronting us, the car slowly turned around and disappeared into the distance. No one saw it again. I felt like I could breathe again. But the fear remained, pulsing in every beat of my heart. That night was the last time I saw the strange man. But the trauma of the chase didn't go away so easily. I spent days checking every corner, every shadow, making sure he wasn't waiting for me. Sleeping became difficult, and working at the restaurant was an impossible task. I always felt like someone was watching me, even when no one was there. Finally, I made the decision to move to a different city. I knew I couldn't keep living with that constant fear, and I needed a fresh start somewhere he couldn't find me. I quit the job, packed my things, and left. I never found out who that man was or why he followed me. Sometimes, when I walk through my new city, I still glance over my shoulder, expecting to see him appear somewhere. But I haven't seen him again, and I hope that never changes. Even though I've moved away, his shadow seems to follow me, reminding me that sometimes nightmares can be real and be. It's been a few years now, but that night never left my mind. I used to work at an upscale restaurant in the city center, and the night shift was my favorite. It was peaceful, and I loved how the soft lighting created a cozy atmosphere. The routine was always the same, and I felt safe in that familiar space. Until that night. It was late, the restaurant was nearly empty, and my colleagues had already left. Only a few customers remained at their tables, and I was preparing to close. That's when he walked in. A hooded man dressed in a long black coat. His steps were slow, almost silent, and he headed straight to the most isolated table in the corner. I remember feeling a chill down my spine as he passed me. He didn't order anything. He just sat there, motionless, with the hood covering his face. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel him watching me. The unease crept in, but I tried to ignore it, thinking he might just be waiting for someone. Time passed and no other customers came in. The restaurant emptied out until it was just me and him. When I returned to his table to let him know we were closing, I found the chair empty. The man had disappeared without making a sound. My heart raced when I saw that his hood was still draped over the chair, neatly folded, as if he had left a sign that he wasn't truly gone. The restaurant's lights started flickering, and an eerie silence filled the space. Everything felt different, as if the familiar environment I knew so well had suddenly become something entirely unfamiliar. I heard a low noise coming from the kitchen, like a soft scraping. The restaurant, which had always been a refuge of calm for me, had transformed into a maze of shadows and echoes. I tried to stay calm, but something felt off. With every step I took, I had the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I walked to the front door to check if it was locked and prepared to leave, but deep down, I knew he was still there, somewhere. I stood by the front door, my hand trembling as I fumbled with the keys. The silence in the restaurant was overwhelming, broken only by the faintest creaks and distant sounds that I couldn't quite place. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to leave, but something held me back, some irrational sense that the danger was still close, too close. I turned around, scanning the empty tables. My eyes were drawn to the dark corners of the room where shadows seemed to move, shifting unnaturally with the flickering lights. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my heart pounded harder with each passing second. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flash of movement near the kitchen door. My breath caught in my throat. There was no mistaking it this time. Someone or something was there. I felt a wave of cold fear wash over me. It wasn't just my nerves playing tricks on me. He was still here. I forced myself to move, my feet feeling like they were made of lead. I hurried toward the back exit, trying to stay quiet, but the sound of my footsteps echoed too loudly in the empty space. The closer I got to the kitchen, the stronger the feeling of being watched became, like eyes boring into the back of my head. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle. Just as I touched it, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I froze, my pulse racing. I didn't dare turn around. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could feel the presence of the hooded man, though I still couldn't see him. Panic surged through me, and I yanked the door open, bolting into the cold night air. I stumbled out of the restaurant, gasping for breath as the cold wind hit my face. My legs felt weak, but I kept running, not daring to look back. The street was deserted, the city oddly silent at this hour. It should have been a relief to be outside, away from the oppressive atmosphere of the restaurant, but the fear clung to me like a second skin. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see him chasing me. But the street was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that he was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. After what felt like hours, I finally slowed down, my lungs burning from the cold air. I stopped under a streetlight, trying to catch my breath, and forced myself to think. I was out, I was safe, but the thought of what had happened inside the restaurant gnawed at me. Who was that man? Why had he been there? And what did he want? I never got the answers to those questions. The restaurant closed down a few months later. No one ever spoke of the hooded man again, and I never saw him after that night. But even now, every time I walk past a dark alley or enter an empty room, I feel the same chill I felt that night. It's as if he's still there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting. Even after leaving the restaurant behind, the events of that night haunted me. I tried to push it from my mind, telling myself that I had imagined most of it, that the strange flickering lights, the eerie presence, and the hooded figure were just tricks of my overworked brain. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something had been wrong that night, something I couldn't explain or forget. Weeks went by, and I moved on to a new job. Life returned to its usual rhythm, but every now and then, in the stillness of the night, I felt that same creeping sensation of being watched. I would find myself glancing nervously over my shoulder, my heart skipping a beat at the slightest sound. One night, months after the incident, I was walking home after work, taking my usual route through the quiet streets of the city. The air was still, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was safe, but the memories of that night resurfaced. The feeling returned, the weight of unseen eyes on me, following my every step. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I scanned my surroundings, but there was nothing, no one. The street was completely empty, yet the fear was there, just as real as it had been in the restaurant. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the paranoia that clung to me like a cold fog. But the faster I walked, the stronger the feeling grew. I could almost hear footsteps behind me, though every time I glanced back, the street was as empty as before. My pulse raced, and I fought the urge to run. As I turned the corner onto a dimly lit side street, I froze. Standing at the end of the alley, partially hidden in the shadows, was a figure. My stomach dropped. The hood, the same black coat. It was him. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with the possibility that I was imagining things again, but the figure didn't move. He just stood there, watching. My feet felt rooted to the ground, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't let fear control me like it had that night in the restaurant. Summoning every ounce of courage, I took a step forward. The figure didn't react. I took another step, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, suddenly, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. I ran after him, my fear giving way to a desperate need for answers. But when I reached the spot where he had stood, there was nothing. No sign of him. No indication that anyone had been there at all. For the first time since that night, I felt something lift off my shoulders. The fear that had gripped me for so long began to fade. It was as if, in confronting the hooded figure, I had finally broken free from the hold he had over me. I walked home that night with a sense of closure, knowing that whatever had haunted me for so long was finally behind me. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.